Hi, and welcome to the DRose Social Impact Webinar, talking about power of participation. The power of participation really is just around how we engage our diverse stakeholders and what that looks like for our organisation. Um, Participation and engagement aren't necessarily the same thing, and it's important that we kind of explore what those things mean for our specific organisations and our specific situations. So as usual, this webinar is going to be fully structured, practice focused. Oh, didn't change that, not cultural competency, stakeholder engagement webinar, designed to strengthen our ethical and equitable and cultural responsive practice. Designed to work across sectors, corporate, education, healthcare, community, non-profit, all of that. Shouldn't matter where you work, you should be able to apply what we're sharing. Um, the recording should be around 60 minutes. The 90-minute sessions is when we're delivering live, and because it includes Q&As. Um, the, the sessions are meant to be interactive, when we provide activities, reflection prompts, and real-world application for the resources that we share. And then we include targeted resources for continued learning, so you can take the activities from the event and go and use them in your real-world spaces. If you don't know me already, my name is Sabrina Shadie. I'm the founder of DRose, which is a multi-award winning specialist in ethics and equity strategy. We're a learning organisation, really focused around development and coaching services. I have personal experience of intersectionality. I have a professional background in education, behaviour management, health, community and governance. Um, with over 26 years of experience, professional experience in diversity, inclusive learning and accessible engagement. A long-term member of a number of national and international advisory boards offering social impact expertise, and I'm a fellow of a few kind of professional institutes in this area, whether it's leadership, training and development, or equality, diversity and inclusion. So the learning outcomes for this event are around understanding participation as a power and accountability challenge, recognise power structures and inequalities within organisational cultures, identify barriers to meaningful stakeholder engagement, explore how to embed representative and equitable participation within organisational systems, learn practical approaches to strengthening community action and shared decision making. The framing part of participation, like how do we frame it going beyond the consultation? Because participation is more than asking for input, it's about who shapes outcomes. So the core concept really are going to look at participation as influence, not just presence, which I think is somewhere that we often go wrong as leaders. Low-hanging fruit, we often pick a consultation process, but it doesn't necessarily actually inform the change process in the way that it needs to be effective. The difference between consultation, engagement, and co-creation. The relationship between participation, trust, and organisational legitimacy. The risk of tokenistic or performative engagement. And the reflections are, and again, anytime we're asking you to reflect and you've got questions, feel free to stop the video, take a moment to really process what you're being asked. Maybe make some notes. It probably helps to have a pen and paper during the process. But take a moment to reflect on who currently influences decisions in your organisation. What are the mechanisms to influence decision making? You can access the systems and processes of leadership and challenge on change. And how do you protect against gatekeeping? And that's a tricky one because a lot of people don't necessarily recognise that things are being gatekept, but gatekeeping is probably right up there in the top 5 challenges for organisations to overcome in relation to applying social impact work. So we're going to quickly look at some key terms and definitions. The first one is stakeholder. People don't necessarily know what stakeholder refers to. And stakeholder is any individual, group or community that is affected by or has the ability to influence an organisation's decisions and activities. It's a really broad term that includes everybody who is inside your organisation or has influence or is impacted by your organisation. So it includes internal and external, so your employees, your leadership team, your trustees, your board, but also those outside of your organisation. Your physical neighbours, who else lives, works and functions in the locality of where your organisation is founded, is based. Who is impacted by the services, not because they're service users, but because the service runs nearby where they are. So all of those people who might be impacted, and particularly those who are often underrepresented. So some of the people who you're impacting, you may not even know you're impacting, because they live locally, but they're not actually part of your organisation, or you haven't built relationships in certain spaces, but you function there, and maybe their organisation uses the same community centre as you, or shared car park, something like that. There's lots of people who might be stakeholders in a kind of very loose way, but are still impacted by the organisation. Representation refers to the extent to which different groups are presented and visible within decision-making spaces. Meaningful representation goes beyond numbers to include influence, authority, and voice. I would also add that representation does not necessarily mean having a single person from a specific protected characteristic in a leadership space means that everybody with that same protected characteristic is represented, because we are not, as human beings, homogenous groups. So just because you have, let's say, a global majority person who's also from the LGBTQ plus community in your leadership team does not mean that all Black people and all LGBTQ plus communities are represented there. That's not how that works. So we need to be aware of that, because tokenism occurs when inclusion is delivered in a symbolic or superficial way, which is what not getting representation right often does, without genuine influence or power, and without genuine representation. There are lots of people, I'm not going to name names, but you can probably identify them, in high-powered leadership positions within the UK who outwardly appear that they would represent minority communities. However, their behaviour, their actions, their values, the decisions they make definitely harm those communities more than they help those communities. Therefore, that's not representation. And anybody who points to those individuals saying, well, it's not racist because blah blah's there, or it's not sexist because look at that person there, does not prove the point of representation. It actually proves the point of tokenism. And I think values, shared values, is actually the key to representation and the key to avoiding tokenism, more than links between protected characteristics. But I think we'll talk about that more as we go on. Being aware that tokenism often creates the appearance of inclusion without delivering meaningful change. So that goes to the examples that I was sharing. And the second part of that is actually around empowerment, because empowerment involves in addressing power structures so individuals and communities have control, influence, and agency in decisions that affect them, supported by access to resources and opportunities. So you can see that if we don't get the representation right, and we have lots of tokenism and people who are there either symbolically, or people who are there who don't share the values that empower the communities they're meant to represent, that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing lots of people who don't really represent. They do things in a tokenistic, symbolic way, and it fails to empower the communities that they're supposed to be representing, because they don't actually share the same values, and they don't prioritize the empowerment of those minoritized communities or those underrepresented communities. And one of the ways that we can get around that and really change that is by developing and delivering on co-design or co-production, co-creation, co-delivery approaches. So these co-words are really about involving stakeholders, working in partnership with organisations to design, develop and deliver solutions, and that's suitable solutions that they've, you know, that meet their needs, not just that meet the organisation's needs, based on shared power, mutual respect and recognition of lived experience as a valuable expertise. It's not a nice to have, it's not an add-on, it's not an anecdote. It's actually vital for getting this kind of work right. So, power dynamics and stakeholder engagement is really important. We want to talk about the power of participation, but to do that, we need to talk about the actual power dynamics, the power structures that underpin the organisation, the work we do, society, and have an understanding of the structures which we're working within. So, participation cannot be understood without examining power dynamics and structures. Key areas: formal versus informal power within the organisation. And again, feel free to stop the video and map. Okay, who has the power? Where are decisions made? We do have some other tools that help with that. If you're interested, I will share links in the content with the video. Whose knowledge is recognised as valid? And that's a really important one, because often lived experience is not seen as important. And the feedback that we get from stakeholders with lived, particular lived experiences aren't always valued in the same way as somebody who comes in with a consultancy fee that's really high, just tell you exactly the same thing. So just be aware of whose knowledge do we put value on. Barriers to participation for historically marginalised groups. This is a common recurring theme. We know it's harder for people with disabilities, neurodiversity, women who have, children, dads who have care responsibilities, other people who have other care responsibilities which aren't part of the, traditional family structure. Those kinds of things can be massive barriers to participation. External pressures shaping participation, policy, funding, and crisis responses. We've spoken about crisis responses in some of the previous videos. They often exclude by the nature of the kind of high pressure and short time frames. So to be aware of those things. Ensuring decision-making processes are explicit and transparent. Good practice. Creating structured opportunities for challenge and dissent. And this is one that a lot of organisations get wrong, because they don't like to be challenged. They don't like people sort of arguing back or pointing out failures. But actually, when you think about it in terms of growth and learning, you have to get things wrong to figure out how to get things right. If you get things right every time on the first go, you don't really learn very much. And you don't understand the process as well. Anyone who creates anything doesn't necessarily get it right the first time, every time. That's not human nature. That's not the reality of experience and experiential learning and all of that stuff. Even if you don't get it completely wrong and fail and fall flat on your face, you still have things you can learn and implement next time to make things better. So recognise that the challenge and dissent can be a really valuable learning and growth tool if harnessed and used constructively in a co-productive manner. And then recognising and addressing structural inequalities, which sounds, really simple little sentence, but can be really hard to apply in practice. To help with that, as ever, we have the DRose Tracer model. The Tracer model has been developed by me as part of our DRose offering, because we recognise that things like equality impact assessments can be really kind of cumbersome and convoluted and a bit complicated, and people don't like using them because it's very time consuming. So this was developed to be a little bit simpler and to ease people into the process. There's a big, full document that you can use with, massive risk assessment options and bits and pieces built into it. But as a simple starting point, you have this model which has a visual representation that allows you to quickly run through the key components of inclusive or equitable practice in what you're doing. So ask yourself some questions about your project or the activity or the change that you're making. Transparency. Are we using open, honest communication channels? Representation. Do we have good stakeholder engagement? Accountability. Have we got clear and reliable accountability pathways throughout our organisation? So if things go wrong, we know who's going to pick up the pieces and fix the problem. Accessibility. Do we have good methodology for reasonable adjustments? It doesn't have to be that difficult. Commitment. What are our long-term support systems? Empowerment. Are we centering lived experience and resources? How are we investing in quality support? So answer those questions and you will get some way towards building your equality impact assessment, especially if you answer those questions with each of the protected characteristics in mind. If you want to do the full course on the tracer, you are very welcome to do so. Again, I'll share the link. Diverse stakeholder engagement and community action. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I am a big believer in community action, in the power of unified action for community values. We work collectively to change this thing that, this inequality, to drive change for education, to improve situations for human rights or reproductive health, or any of the social challenges that our communities are facing right now. And the DRose Tracer Equality Impact Assessment Tool, so EIA, Equality Impact Assessment Tool, that's what that does. So transparency in decision-making processes, representation in terms of who influences outcomes, accountability for acting on input, so the feedback you get, the consultations you might take on, accessibility of engagement opportunities. Do not host your engagement event in a building that has low access or is really far away or is not connected by public transport. That's not accessible. Commitment to sustained involvement. All of these one and done projects are damaging and extractive in most cases. And yeah, you need to have a sustained engagement program. Empowerment of stakeholders. This is not supposed to be an extractive process. It needs to be a collaborative process. And then resources allocated to support participation. Our EIA tool helps to, or any EIA tool really, if you already have one that you use, I'm not saying stop using it. They help you explore engagement questions. And again, stop to answer these questions if that helps. Who currently holds decision-making power in your organisation? And I say it like that because obviously your leadership team, obviously your directors, obviously your board or your trustees. But actually, there's also a whole series of small decisions that are made every day within an organisation that direct how things happen. Who gets to hear about what's happening? Who gets to know about what opportunities are coming up? How information is shared, how individuals may engage with opportunities or each other, or engage in spaces. So who currently holds those powers, those subtle currents? Because that makes a big difference about your organisational culture and how your stakeholders can safely engage. How are engagement processes managed and monitored? What resources are available and who has access to them? And is the current approach working and supporting stakeholders appropriately? And I'll probably add in there which stakeholders, because if you look at the protected characteristics as identified in the Equality Act, you'll find some of your systems benefit some stakeholders more than others. What we've seen recently is women are particularly benefiting from some of the equality work that's taken place, but other minority groups, other groups, historically marginalised, historically underserved groups are not getting the same level of opportunity still. So who are the gatekeepers? Who's holding on to the resources? Who's directing the information about what opportunities are coming up into certain spaces and not into other spaces? As I said in previous content, I worked in an organisation where it was predominantly women across the whole organisation and a very, 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 very low percentage of men working in the organisation. Completely out of sync with how many other organisations are, where there's kind of less women and more men. This was the opposite. But particular people in the organisation really didn't want to even consider the idea that they should have a employee resource group for men, because in that environment they were the minority, and it wasn't understood that as in that experience they are a minority and they are still protected by the Equality Act. And that was a real challenge to try and help people understand that culturally any group that is minoritized within the space needs to be represented and needs to be supported. So understand who the gatekeepers are and what they're gatekeeping and why. So when we have these kinds of challenges in our culture of the organisation, it can be really challenging to create an inclusive environment where people feel, I want to say, properly safe. So engaging diverse stakeholders meaningfully, and I do use this word meaningfully quite a lot when we're talking about how we do social impact work, because people can do it tokenistically or people can do it meaningfully. And obviously I prefer meaningfully, because if it's not meaningful, why are you doing it? Inclusion requires early, accessible and representative engagement. And those areas are really important. They're back to the equality impact assessment tool, right? Early, we start it before the actual activity happens, not after the fact. We engage people. We make sure that it's accessible by listening to their lived experience and understanding their needs. And we make it representative. We ensure that the people who are least represented have the space and are able to voice their requirements so that they can engage fully. And that's what meaningful actually means. So principles of effective engagement. Engagement happens before decisions are made, not after, and that's really key. That's why we say early access, right? Participation must be accessible in a format, timing, or in the format, the timing, and the design. So the way it's being presented, the time. So one of the practical challenges that I find around accessibility, for example, when my daughter was very poorly with her heart condition, but was still in school, all of the clinics that ran for people with her condition ran during the day. So it was like 11 o'clock on a Tuesday, which is when she was supposed to be in maths class. And I had a massive sort of back and forth with the GP surgery to say she can't attend at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday because she's supposed to be in her maths lesson. I need an alternative time outside of school hours. And they didn't have an alternative time outside of school hours. because people with my daughter's condition are generally older and generally retired or have been medically retired because of the condition. So it was just so inaccessible for somebody her age that it was not fit for purpose, and we had to come up with a whole different regime to allow her to have her bloods taken on the same day but after school. And then they didn't make it accessible because I then had to drive her blood vial in the little packet to the hospital, to the phlebotomy department, to drop it off to make sure it would be tested in time for her next round of medication. And it, completely inaccessible. So participation, the format of that, the timing of that, and the design of that were not accessible, not suitable. It was only because as a carer, I put the extra work in to close the gaps in the loop to ensure my child's care was managed. But we find that for a lot of diverse stakeholders, that the onus is put on them to close those loops, not on the services, not on the organisations, because they're very rigid in their processes and they're not accessible, they're not being equitable in their approach, and they're not recognising the need of their stakeholders for them to adjust to make it more accessible and more inclusive. Lived experience must be treated as knowledge and not anecdote. And unfortunately, we see this a lot. It's used as anecdote, or it's considered to be anecdote. And I think, again, if you look at recent parliamentary discussions where people have stood up and shared lived experience, be it their own or lived experience given, shared with them by constituents, about the impact of how current policies are affecting communities or affecting certain families. And they give those heartfelt, this is what happened, these are the facts, and this is how the perspective of those constituents or those individuals. I think that is very powerful. And because we know these experiences don't happen in isolation, we need to recognise that as evidence. It's evidence. It's not anecdotal, and it's not like a side piece over here. It's not appendices. It is the clear facts of hundreds of people of a particular background having the same, experiencing the same barriers or the same challenges or the same discrimination. That's facts. That's evidence. We should treat it as such. Organisations must be prepared to act on feedback. This is where often organisations fall down. They do surveys, they do consultations, they do all this great information gathering, and then they do what with it? Put it on the shelf and forget about it. Or they're not very good at feeding back to their stakeholders who engaged and gave them that information on what they've done about that information, what their plan is, how it's been used to promote a new system, or to recognise some challenges or whatever. If you're not telling people what you did with it, it looks like you didn't do anything with it. If you didn't do anything with it and you didn't tell people how their feedback supported the development of the organisation, you're not doing the thing properly. Feedback is meant to be a loop. It's a two-way or even wider, depending on how many partners and stakeholders you're engaging, loop. So everybody is engaging, everybody's talking, everybody's sharing. So practical approaches, stakeholder mapping based on influence and impact. So we will be sharing a tool to help with that, which allows people to map where their stakeholders are and how much power they have in relation to their engagement and their participation of the organisation. Co-design sessions and participatory decision-making groups. So again, a good example is your employee resource groups or internal staff networks, whatever sort of phraseology you might use around that. But the groups for your internal employees to feed into decision making. That should be designed by the people who are sitting in the group. It shouldn't be a top-down process. The structures and the internal workings of those groups should be decided by those groups. And even how they feed into and link back into the main organisation. That should be a co-design process where they're helping write the policies and the structures and the procedures about how the networks are represented and supported and all of that stuff. Investment in community relationships, long term, not one-off engagement projects. And we do see lots of one-off engagement projects because that's what funding is available, or that's what the leadership are deemed they're willing to do. But we find they're actually quite extractive, build the wrong kind of, they don't build momentum, they don't build continuation, they don't build long-term safety, support and structures. Like the kind of pride. We put the flag up in our backgrounds or on our website, the beautiful rainbow flag. We put it up for a month, but we don't do anything to support our LGBTQ plus communities. So we need to avoid that kind of very short-term, one and done approach to engagement opportunities. And then fair recognition and resourcing of community contributions. This one is really close to my heart because we see so much extractive practice happening. How are we remunerating our stakeholders when they engage, when they bring their expertise and their insight and their value and their expertise to our organisation and to our stakeholder engagement programs and to our consultations and to our events? How do we recognise that? How do we reimburse them for that? How do we make it so that it's actually, we incentivise that engagement, we make it valuable to them? And I don't just mean in terms of finance. Yeah, you can pay people if that is feasible, but actually, how do you make it a valuable experience? How do you make it long-term and uplifting, and so that it actually puts value back into their experience? What is it that they need? What is it that would make it valuable to them? What do they require from it to make it more meaningful than, more meaningful than it is extractive? And that's not always an easy thing to resolve. And I think, again, that's why conversations and engagement, one of the things that we used to do when working with a big volunteer team was that everybody had a plan of why they were volunteering, why they were doing it, what the value was, and what they needed to get out of it at the end. And before they did 1 hour of voluntary work, the organisation had to commit to providing them with the things they asked for, whether that was references, this many hours of experience for university or a course of some kind, or to help them get a reference for college. All kinds of different things that people needed from the experience to help them move along in their career path or in their educational journey or whatever that was. An organisation can support that. It's not a financial remuneration, but it is a valuable one if we can tailor the work and tailor the relationship to meet the needs of those individuals. From participation to community action, because we love community action. I'm just like trying to hold it back. So the key themes around our community action, because participation is quite passive, community action is active. There's nothing wrong with a bit of participation, but it should be moving us towards something. We participate to, what's the outcome? And this is where we talk about outcomes. So looking at building collective responsibility for outcomes. It's not the organisation's outcomes, it's a collective outcome. It's value for everyone. Supporting community-led initiatives and leadership. I spoke previously in other videos about leadership. Leadership is not the title. It's not, this manager or head of, or that's not what leadership is. Leadership is the people who inspire and motivate and support and connect and elevate employees, stakeholders, partners, whoever. The people who naturally lead, You know, we have people who you might consider, you know, the mum or the auntie or the uncle or whatever of the team, right? Who just naturally falls into that role because that's who they are. They're natural born leaders, the people who really care, the people who do the work, who build the relationships, not because that's part of their paid role, but because that's who they are, that's what they care to do. Supporting those leaders and initiatives that they develop will encourage not just powerful participation, but will encourage good outcomes, shared outcomes, value-led outcomes for the organisation and for the stakeholders. Because it strengthens the networks, it strengthens the partnerships, and that those individuals within our organisations who are naturally those leaders, the people that people turn to when things aren't great, the people that people look to for advice and guidance, the people, the fixers, those people are the people that strengthen our networks and help build our partnerships. And moving from organisational control to shared power. And that can feel quite scary, but where you have really empowered stakeholders who believe in the organisation, believe in the vision, believe in the mission, believe in the values, they build a great culture, and sharing the power with them elevates the organisation more than it will ever hinder it. Participation should lead to shared ownership and action, not isolated engagement. And that is truly what we should all be aiming for. It takes a lot of pressure off the more formal leadership, because if you know you've got a great team of people, your stakeholders are all bought in and they're all on side and they're all working towards that shared vision, actually, there's less for you to worry about and try to sort of have to micromanage. And actually organising isolated engagement is way harder than managing and supporting a really empowered and really motivated and really engaged bunch of stakeholders who are keen to move the thing forward. So then actions really need to be around research and identifying other organisations which have shifted from consultation methodologies to co-delivery methodologies. So it might be a Google search, it might be searching from within your network already, to look at what the co-delivery outcome really looks like and what the transition shift looked like. It won't be the same for everyone, but I'm a great believer in looking at what others have done, learning from it, and adapting it for your needs. There is no point in reinventing the wheel. There are people out there doing great work. Go and learn from them, and then look at their outcome. How long did it take? You know, how involved are their stakeholders now? What does their business model look like? You know, what does their leadership structure look like? Did that change much? What changes needed to happen? How did they address issues of gatekeeping? So there's so much to kind of understand about that transition process, whether you do it in full or, you know, you're just doing part. Again, I would say stop the video, answer those questions, have a think, do the little research project. Maybe you already know an organisation that went from that kind of more top-down consultation into a co-delivery. Maybe you've not really even heard of co-delivery before. Either way, again, I would suggest stop the video, do the research activity, and yeah, I'd be really interested to hear what your findings were. Accountability and measuring participation. Measuring participation can be a real challenge. People don't always know how to gather the evidence, how to collate it, how to, you know, use GDPR effectively. And it can be daunting so people don't collect the information. Participation must be evidenced and not assumed. Participation, you know, you only go into a space and they're clicking everybody in, so they know how many people physically in the building. That is not really evidence of participation. And I think that's where a lot of organisations, we do fall down. We count heads in a room. So many people have attended this training. So many people, were in the meeting where we announced the thing. That's not the same. Or so many people get our newsletter, maybe. That's not the same as participation. So using tools like equality impact assessments, as described earlier, we can review our processes, collate evidence of participation and impact. And for me, participation really looks at the impact. We had 100 people attend our event. Of that 100, 20 people scanned the QR code and gave us feedback on the event, and the feedback suggested. Now, you've only got evidence of 20 people participating. 100 people arrived and attended. They could have all been on their phones for the entire event. You've got no evidence to prove otherwise, right? So the 20 people who gave you feedback using the QR code, those people participated. You can't evidence the rest of the participation, however much people may or may not have. So it's important that we understand that the way we evidence needs to be adjusted for the different spaces that we might operate in. Okay. Applying clear systems for collecting and reporting on stakeholder participation, co-creation and co-delivery. So if you organise an event where you actually have co-creation, co-design, and co-delivery, you will find you have a higher level of participation, because you don't just ask the participants, your stakeholders, to provide a feedback through your QR. They were involved from the beginning. We had 5 stakeholder representatives on the committee to organise the event. We had 10 individuals from our stakeholder group deliver a speech, man exhibition table, working on the front desk, walking around with a clipboard, asking people to give feedback in real time. We collected, I don't know, let's say 15 to 25 video interview clips from participants attending the event about their experience and about why they attended on the day. It's a very different result. So you would be able to say a much higher number of people participated, not just the 20 who gave you feedback, but all of the people who are involved in developing, delivering, collating the information throughout the event. And that is how co-design and co-creation really has a much bigger impact on how we engage and how we empower people to be involved with our organisations. So how does your organisation prioritise listening to stakeholders? Lived experience is knowledge and insight gained from directly experiencing a situation or system or organisation, such as inequality, discrimination, or barriers to access. It's recognised as a valid and essential form of expertise, and we need to treat it as such. Like, that's really important. Again, you may want to stop the video while you answer these questions. What evidence would demonstrate that participation is meaningful in your organisation? Now, again, that will come from the lived experience, so you need to ask the people. You need to be listening to the people with that lived experience. What metrics show the value of participation for stakeholder groups? Again, you need to be asking stakeholder groups, is this valuable? How valuable is this? What would make it more valuable? How can we, incentivize engagement better? What is it you need that would make it more effective for you? Ask the questions, have the conversations, and not just as a survey you're sending out, not just as a kind of, online kind of faceless. Have the conversation, build the discussion, build the relationships. Anonymous or anonymized surveys that you send out into the ether, they have their place. I'm not degrading them. I think they can be very valuable, But when you're trying to build relationships, they are not necessarily the best mechanism. There's better ways, I think, of engaging our stakeholders in a way that will show that we prioritise their feedback, their lived experience, and our connection with them. And then, the really important one, how is stakeholder feedback collected and actioned? There is a whole thing around how to build feedback loops with stakeholder engagement, which is really important. And it really links into like learning cycles and stuff like that around, you said we did kind of methodologies. And I can't praise them enough because it needs to be reciprocal relationship. And we need to be evidencing our work anyway. So make sure that you've got to be really transparent why you're collecting, the GDPR around what you're collecting, the value and purpose of what you're connecting, how you're going to use the information, what you're going to do with it after you've used it. You're going to bin it, you're going to make sure that everything's scrubbed, how you implementing GDPR and how you're protecting people's data and information, and then what you're going to do with it, how you're going to do that, and telling people, this is what we did. We did this thing and this thing. Thanks for the information you gave us. We used it to do blah, 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 blah. And it's going to inform our next steps to do this, 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 and this. I think sometimes that is so overlooked, but it is vital, because if I know that I've contributed to something, I want to know how that contribution had an impact in the long term. Common pitfalls, and how to avoid them. Risks to address. We talk about risk a lot in this space because when we work with people, there's always risk. Anytime you work with people, there is risk, and we need to be aware of that, and we need to manage it appropriately. Now, we're not talking about risks in terms of health and safety, but actually discriminatory practice and exclusionary practices can be as harmful as trips, slips, and falls in reality, because the harm and the damage they cause for the organisation and for the individual can be as damaging and as long term. So recognising that late stage consultation presented as participation, it's not cutting it. That's not how we work. That's not who we are. Over-reliance on the same stakeholder voice. Oh, look, we have our one Black person on the committee and we're just going to keep leaning on them. Oh, look, we have somebody who's neurodiverse in senior leadership. We're going to use that tokenism and tick the box and move on, and not really worry about how we may or may not be supporting other types of neurodiversity even. Excuse me. Extractive engagement without feedback or action. And extractive engagement is such a broad spectrum where, even the people, even the stakeholders who are being used as the same person gets wheeled out for every diversity conversation, or gets tagged in for every diversity conversation. Even that person might not realise how extractive this mechanism is, or how this practice has become. But it's very extractive, it's very exploitative, and it's super tokenistic. Misunderstanding the value of representation. I once worked for an educational organisation. When I asked to be part of the equality board within the educational organisation, I was told we already have a Black woman on the panel. The panel was like 6 to 8 people, 7 of whom were white, middle-aged males and females. And there was one person from a completely different ethnic background to me, but they already had one person of colour who was female on the board. They didn't need any more, as far as they were concerned. That was the answer I was given, with a straight face, and I was not allowed to join that board because they had no comprehension of what representation actually looks like. Now, the person who was on the board, the other lady from an ethnic minority background, did a brilliant job. Like, I can't fault her. We are still friends. However, the way the board was managed was appalling. So bear that in mind when we talk about representation. It's never the one and done. It needs to be reflective of the demographics, needs to be reflective of the skill set, and it needs to be linked to the need within the organisation, stakeholder need. So if you have a huge proportion of stakeholders from a particular community where you function, where you operate. So if you're talking about the school where I grew up, they've got quite a high proportion of Bangladeshi community in that physical location. So you should have a higher proportion of Bangladeshi representation in any leadership space, so that that community is appropriately represented. Whether that's, think about the school that I went to, there should be a good proportion of Bangladeshi representatives on the parent board, right? Because you've got a high proportion in the community, which means you have a high proportion in the school of students. So you should have equivalent representation in the governing space to represent those children and those families. And misunderstanding, oh no, we've got one, so that's enough. That's not how this works. Similarly, for things like disability, having a single disabled person in a space isn't the equivalent, because there's so many different types of disability. Somebody with a disability of a specific type cannot represent all disabilities. It's not physically possible, it's not practical, it's not realistic. And it's very difficult to have all disabilities represented, but we need to understand representation in a more inclusive, more holistic and broader spectrum kind of perspective to make it effective. Under resourcing community involvement, we see this a lot. We have put forward project proposals, we've been given the go-ahead, we've been promised a certain amount of funding. Halfway through developing the project, we've been told the funding is half of what we were promised, and we have a choice to either downgrade the project or to self-fund half of it, or just to cancel and let our community down. And obviously we pretty much always self-fund the missing funding. But under-resourcing community involvement is a massive damaging risk to engagement and empowerment of stakeholders. And then prioritising organisational representation over stakeholder experience. And quite often it is literally seen as they're mutually exclusive. Organisations want to maintain their representation, squeaky clean, never made a mistake, we're great, look at us, we're brilliant, yay. While they know that historically their cultures and their behaviours and their impact is not necessarily what it needs to be for the stakeholders. But rather than do the work to fix that and join, meet the stakeholders where they're at, they want to protect their representation, sweep all the nasty things under the carpet, and ignore the stakeholder experience. So the stakeholders then become even further excluded and demonized often for sharing their experience, or for identifying challenges, or for stating that things aren't how they should be, or for identifying that the organisation has let them down in some way. And that's, again, really damaging and the opposite of what needs to happen. So what are the mitigation strategies? Build participation into governance and planning cycles. This is not an easy step. This is often an overwhelming step and a long, drawn-out process, because A, do you understand what your governance structures are? So many people don't understand what the governance structures are, or how to do good governance in terms of ethical and equitable processes. Your governance structure should be representative, should be linked into, like the Equality Act should feed into your governance structures. But so many organisations we've worked with, the two things are like dealt with separately. And that's a real challenge. So look at your governance structures, look at your planning cycles, and look at how your stakeholders currently engage, if there's mechanisms for them to engage, and what pathways you could start building to enable them to engage more effectively and in an empowered way, not in a controlled way. Consider your duty of care as an organisation to your stakeholders. You have a higher duty of care to your employees than you do to your neighbours, but you must consider it across the board with all your stakeholders when you're looking at engagement. Provide clear feedback loop with visible outcomes. Again, we already kind of covered it, but being clear about, we're asking our people in our location to give us feedback on this thing because we're going to do this project and we're going to use your feedback to do this and this, and we're going to have 2 dates after the project's completed to tell you how we used your information, what we're going to do about it next, and how we're going to, you can click here to read our privacy policy about what we're going to do with your consultation data once we've done the thing and how long we're going to keep it for, and blah, 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 blah. Good practice is, not just good compliance, good practice, which is way up there, is one of the key strategies, not just for equitable stakeholder engagement, but for sustainable long-term stakeholder engagement. Invest in long-term relationships with stakeholders and communities. The more we invest in these long-term relationships, the more these people become advocates for our organisation, the more information they're willing to share with us to guide us to do the work well, and the more reciprocal the relationships naturally become. And then create internal accountability for engagement quality. And often when we're talking about engagement, it's just see, like, did they engage, did they not engage? Yes, no. Actually, what's the quality of the engagement? The value to them and the value to us, and the value in terms of how we build this ongoing long-term relationship with that community or with that group, so that we become part of that community, we become part of their support structure, we become part of their natural habit. Now, I think this is specifically, or particularly, I should say, important for third sector spaces, because that's how we maintain the third sector, is by building community, building relationships, becoming part of people's lives in a way that is meaningful for them. That supports what we're doing in terms of being a charity. So again, we're going to take a moment to reflect, pause and reflect. It's very meditative. All of the work DRose does is reflective practice, and you will start falling into the habit of doing that. Ask yourself these questions. Pause the video, take a moment, make a note. Think who else you might need to tag in to help you answer these questions. Okay. When was the last time stakeholder input genuinely changed a decision in your organisation? Maybe it was yesterday. Maybe it was never. And when you answer this, how could you evidence it? Like, what evidence could you use to prove when this last happened? How confident are you that your current approach to participation reflects your stated organisational values? Again, I have no idea what's happening in your organisation, but can you draw a clear line between the way your organisation manages stakeholder engagement and how that feeds or links to your values? What assumptions do you hold about who wants to participate or who is hard to reach? Now, I hate that term, hard to reach. We've used it because it's a term that's popular. I would suggest we use terms like historically marginalised and excluded groups, underrepresented groups, underserved groups. They're not hard to reach. I know exactly where they are. I could point you in the direction of communities who are underserved, who are underrepresented, and have been for decades. I know exactly where they are. I could literally go to, areas all across the UK and show you exactly where those communities are, be it traveller communities, be it communities of which were originally immigrant communities and where people have, been here since the 40s and 50s post-war efforts, the Windrush communities, LGBTQ plus groups and communities and individuals, whether we're talking about communities from care experienced individuals. I can point you to where those communities are, where those groups are, where you can connect with those individuals. But if you're not doing the work because you already think of them as hard to reach, so you're not doing the investment, you're not doing the relationship building, you're not recognizing the need and the equitable approaches that you need to develop. It's not for them to figure out how to interact with you, it's for you to figure out how to interact with them appropriately. You often find that that gatekeeping mentality is a massive challenge to the development of your stakeholder engagement. You will naturally be drawn to people who are easy to connect with, people who reflect you. They're different, but they reflect you back at you somehow. We see that with, maybe you went to the same university, maybe the stakeholders you engage with studied or come from the same career background as you, same professional kind of engagement. So they may be different from you, but they're the same as you in some other way. So we see that happen quite often. Maybe you're recruiting your volunteers for your organisation from your engagement with the university you attended, right? So you're pulling on other previous students to that space. There's nothing wrong with that, but you'll never reach the communities who are most deprived of engagement in those ways. So just consider, how do you reach the people who are the most different from you? And again, I would not use the term hard to reach. I don't like the term hard to reach. We've used it here for demonstrative purposes. However, terms like underrepresented, historically marginalised, historically excluded, underserved is probably my favourite because it links back to the service we're offering. We underserve these people. We are not supporting these people appropriately. And that puts the onus on us as organisations rather than on them as stakeholders. And that's an important power dynamic to understand. So, power dynamics. You think I kind of set it up that way. How is power distributed, gatekept or protected? And that, again, it's not a question I can answer. It's something you need to think about. I love a mind map. So I would absolutely suggest drawing out a mind map about how the power, who has what power and how stakeholders can access power and who gatekeeps the power, who has the power to control, who has access to the power. All these questions are really vital to understanding how we can overcome barriers to stakeholder engagement. Whose voices carry the most weight? We often have, even within our stakeholder communities, we often have one or two individuals who are front and center every time. Big voices, big personalities. They take up probably 80% of the time that is allotted to stakeholders. Is that representative? Is that the voice we need to hear? It might be exactly the right person, or it might not be. It's worth having to think. Whose perspectives are dismissed or overlooked? Again, this is really important for obvious reasons. What would need to change for participation to shift from consultation to shared power? And then what is the response when decisions are challenged or harm is identified? And again, this is the big one for me, because I believe that a really robust, transparent, and well evidenced complaints and grievance process is a key starting point to meaningful stakeholder engagement. If you have a good complaints process, it starts to build trust. When I say good, I mean not just we can anonymise reports of discrimination. We have an open reporting process, like a portal or something that people can put in a complaint without needing to share too much information about themselves. We protect whistleblowers and people who are making complaints. We feed back where appropriate, and we absolutely 100% of the time take appropriate action, and not decided by one individual, but decided by a small committee which is representative and professionally has the correct expertise to handle such actions and such decisions. That goes a long way to building trust. I do not see that happening in many organisations, sadly. I have seen some amazing starting points, and there's great mechanisms out there, like you can buy in a resource that does the thing absolutely brilliant, and gives you like reporters and data and all of that stuff. But there's a challenge between people who report in anonymously and you've been able to support people and offer feedback. If it's anonymous, how do you connect with that person? So there's some work to be done around that. But actually, when decisions are challenged, like what's the mechanism to challenge? Is there a proper mechanism? Are people confident to challenge? Does challenge happen behind closed doors? Can challenge happen in an open meeting? When harm is identified, when something's gone wrong and harm has been caused, is it swept under the carpet? Is it kept hush-hush? Is it announced in the newsletter, this thing happened, we're really sorry, this is the action we're taking to deal with it. We're working with the stakeholder group to ensure it doesn't happen again. We've addressed the policy failure or the procedural issue that caused this thing to happen. Please, if anybody else has any information, can you come forward so that we can address this? If anybody else has experienced similar. Open, transparent, accountable. That's how we need to deal with these things. When we keep it quiet and hush it up, we are impacting the harm and compounding it, grinding the harm in, really rubbing salt into the wound, because there's probably more people who've experienced it or are experiencing it, and we can't help them because we aren't willing to talk about it openly. And that's, I don't want to harp on about it, but we know in society harms are made worse when we can't talk about them. And I'm going to use some really extreme examples. When we talk about things like rape culture, when we talk about sexual assaults, we know that the shame and the guilt and the embarrassment that comes with those kinds of physical, emotional, mental distress, incidents of distress, lead to people not reporting, lead to people not seeking help, lead to people not getting access to the help and all of that stuff. Discrimination is, although it's maybe not a physical impact in the same way, it has very much the same traumatic impact on a person's mental and emotional health. In the same way that misogyny and sexualized discrimination or gender discrimination or homophobia, disability discrimination, racism, all of these behaviours have that kind of deep-seated, harmful shame, embarrassment, discomfort, challenges around identity, challenges around safety and feeling supported. All of that trauma comes with these incidents. So where harm is identified and then not dealt with properly, it is 100% rubbing salt into the wound. So we need to have mechanisms that help us manage and support the incident and the people reporting effectively in a way that is equitable, looks at safeguarding, protecting that person's safety, and our duty of care. I can't emphasise enough the importance of an organisation understanding its duty of care to anybody within its stakeholder group, but particularly its employees who sit within the protected characteristics when it comes to making reports for harm caused. Happy to have a conversation with anybody about that. You know how to get hold of me if you want to discuss that, or if you need some guidance on that going forward. But we see so much harm. I'm seeing almost like a person a month, if not more, people from diverse backgrounds, people with protected characteristics being bullied and harassed out of their jobs, not because they're not good at their jobs, but because they're neurodiverse, because they asked for flexi time, because they have some other need or difference that has made them a target. And I'm talking about from public sector spaces, from private sector employment, and from charity spaces. And it's not only appalling, it is harmful for society, where people who are from already marginalised spaces, already underserved spaces, are being bullied and harassed in this way because it has economic impact, it has social and you know, it has an impact in terms of all of us, because those people being pushed out of work puts more burden on society for their mental health support and all of those things. But it also really drops the level of trust that people have for the way the system works and the way the system is supposed to protect us, through the Equality Act. And I'm not seeing that right now. I'm really not seeing that right now. So doing this well is vital, and supporting the most underserved people and providing them the right protections and enabling them to voice when things aren't going well, so that we can change that, so we can put the support in place, so we can fulfill our duty of care. I think that's a huge step towards actually addressing a lot of the inequalities that people are facing in this moment, but long term as well. So then, social impact. How does your approach strengthen or weaken trust with stakeholders? Which is, how do you measure whether participation leads to meaningful change? And again, conversations, building those relationships. That's how we get that long-term measure. That's how we can discover what that long-term impact looks like and how people experience them. Where could effective participation lead to more equitable outcomes? And then what value or incentives are available for stakeholders to participate in organisations? We all have a little goodie bag, some stickers, and maybe a bit of lip balm or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm still a sucker for a goodie bag. But like I said earlier, there are other ways to compensate people for the commitment they're making to your organisation. And one of those for me would be, how are we looking at promotional pathways, co-coaching, where you pair people up with senior leadership and you give them sort of some mutually beneficial coaching relationship, where they get some leadership coaching and they provide some lived experience coaching into the leadership, members of leadership, to develop that broader understanding. Oops, click on the old trigger finger. So the leadership responsibility, and again, it could be something that we know as leaders we have a responsibility. But in terms of participation and engaging our stakeholders, it can be something we overlook and delegate or kind of don't take seriously. Participation is not a communication tool. It's a leadership commitment to share power. Does that feel uncomfortable, sharing power? Sometimes we don't trust our stakeholders, and that lack of trust is then reciprocal. So to build trust and deliver equitable outcomes, we need to share power. Organisations that embed meaningful participation make better decisions, build stronger relationships, respond to sector changes and trends, and deliver more sustainable social impact. Embedding meaningful participation requires leaders to make decision-making processes transparent. Again, can be really uncomfortable, can feel really vulnerable, but transparency is so vital. Actively enable diverse and representative voices to influence outcomes. Let people impacted lead. Like, empower them to lead. Let them make the decision. Recognise the value of lived experience. Allocate time, resources, and authority to engagement activity. I know budgets are often tight. I know resources can feel very limited. But by making that allocation and giving clarity, the outcomes are much more manageable. And then remain accountable for how stakeholder input shapes decisions. In our equality impact assessment, and actually in a lot of our work, we ask that leaders name the individual who is responsible for the outcome. So if everything fell down and went wrong, who's ultimately responsible? Because that's the person who should be ensuring that the things happen. And quite often, you know, within organisations, things can get blurry, or priorities change, timelines change, something comes up, there's a crisis, whatever. But actually that accountability, you know, whether it's head of people, one of the directors, a trustee, it's got to be somebody who actually holds the reins, because we see so much where so many cases where social impact or EDI or employee resource, whatever, is given to somebody who has no budget, who has high level of deliverables or KPIs, but has no team. It's just them, one individual. They've got no one to delegate to. They're expected to be an absolute ridiculous number of meetings for their input, you know, it's a social impact perspective. So they have no time to actually deliver on the deliverables. And then at the end of the year, everyone goes, oh, well, we did some great work. We didn't actually have any outcomes. We didn't have any impact, but great work, well done, tick, move on. And that is not how this work actually pans out. So who's going to be accountable? It has to be somebody with budget, and it has to be somebody with authority. If it hasn't, if the person hasn't got budget and authority and doesn't have a team to delegate to, then you're wasting everybody's time. Okay, action planning and reflection. Again, you may want to pause the video. Individual reflection. Where is participation strongest in your organisation? It's really important that you are clear and honest with yourself about this, because it's not always easy. Sometimes the answers to these questions are very uncomfortable. I'm not asking you to share them with me or with the DRose community. This is for your reflection. You don't have to share it anywhere. You don't even have to share it within your organisation, but sometimes it can be helpful to do so. Where does the approach to participation need to change? Again, participation is whose participation are you measuring here? That's something you need to be aware of. What is needed to connect communities? And what is one action you can take within the next 30 days? That's, you know, maybe you can take 2 actions in the next 30 days. I don't know, have a think. And maybe who do you need to help you take the actions? Have you got a team? Is there a couple of people within the resource group existing who are quite motivated? Maybe it would help for them to share this video with them. But yeah, take a moment to answer those questions. Suggested immediate action. So this is our suggestions. You may need to tweak these. Review a recent decision. Was there clear stakeholder influence? And that's a kind of yes, no. I would also add a sub question. how diverse was the stakeholder engagement on influence on that decision? Is it the same stakeholder that you always use, or is it through the same methodology? Is it the same stakeholder employee resource groups? You know, how diverse and how representative is your stakeholder influence? Map gaps in representation. So use an equality impact assessment or similar tool. I think it's a really good place to start by listing the protected characteristics as identified in the Equality Act, and then consider your representation against each of the protected characteristics. As an equality impact assessment tool, that's a really good first step if you haven't actually got a tool as such. You can literally just list, you know, age, gender, blah, 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 put the list of 9. You can add extras on the bottom if you want. We've spoken about that previously in other videos. You could have, you know, women, menopause. You could have carers, parents and carers. You could have people with care experience. You could have veterans. So you can have the additional groups who are also potentially vulnerable or underrepresented. And you can list or identify, give maybe a score out of 10 of how well represented they might be within your stakeholder commitments. Introduce one structured participatory space. Co-design it with a target of the target stakeholder group to ensure it's fit for purpose. So from the mapping, who do you have least representation of? And maybe pick that group as your target group as a starting point. Say, okay, we do not have many, let's say, young people as a really easy example. We're missing, you know, there's very few people in our organisation from the age of 18 to 25. We have hardly any 18 to 25-year-olds. Why do we think that is? And then introduce an activity where you know, maybe work with a university or a college or somewhere where you know has that age group, that are really good at working with that age group. Build a partnership with that organisation to connect with that stakeholder group and co-design something, a project, a space to build your engagement with that specific stakeholder group for the long term. I use universities and colleges as a starting point because I find they're really good sources of innovation and new thinking and changes to methodology and all of that great stuff. So you can really tap into it. And a lot of those educational spaces will really welcome a kind of enterprise project alongside an existing organisation. We've worked with a couple of universities in that kind of way before, and it can be really, really valuable. And then to deliver ethical and equitable stakeholder engagement, you must collect relevant data within GDPR guidelines. And it's really important that you understand the GDPR and privacy guidelines when you're collecting this data, because if you're collecting anything linked to their equality markers and you're collecting their name or email address, or you already have their name and email address, that is protected under the GDPR. However, you should, as an organisation, already have policies and processes around that. So you probably just need to adapt it a little bit to specifically talk to what you're going to do with stakeholder engagement information. Be transparent and open about resources, aims, and opportunities. Tell people what you're doing, why you're doing it, what their information is going to lead to, you know, down the line. Recognise and remedy any past harms and failures. The remedy part sits in international legislation, right? International legislation requires for us to repair harm done. So we need to remedy where we have, you know, additional risks or discrimination or harm caused, or, you know, oversight where we, you know, haven't understood the impact is going to maybe have a negative outcome for some groups. There's an onus on organisations to remedy, that's the actual terminology, remedy past harms and current failures. So do be aware of that. And then prioritise empowerment of stakeholders. We are not doing to, we're doing with. Yeah, the with is key. As ever, where processes and systems do not exist within your organisation, please take time to identify and make note of the gaps. consider who needs to be informed of the gaps that you have identified and who can support you to action the necessary changes. Approach the actions in collaboration with your team or colleagues and access external support and resources where you can. Don't try to fix everything at once. Break down the required actions into realistic and manageable tasks. As ever, you can contact me. I am happy to support. So, continuing your learning. Participation is not defined by who is in the room, but by who shapes what happens next. That's, we often have conversations where the people who need to be in the room are not in the room. What can we do about that? Continuing your learning by deepening this work. Expand topical reading and learning. Go and learn more about participation. Go and learn more about stakeholder engagement and empowerment. And there's loads of articles online from reputable sources. DRose has the DRose Insights kind of blog space. You're welcome to go and explore that. We have the Ethics in Action professional subscription, which is exactly what it says. It's reflective practice for ethical practitioners with resources, support, guidance, all kinds of tools and community opportunities. And then obviously DRose Academy content development bundles and workshops. We have a ton of workshops. We have a ton of structured resources to help leaders. We also have some recommended reading lists, and we also have some recommendations to partner organisations who we know give great information, hold great webinars, provide amazing newsletters and updates. So you can access that as well. Oh, sorry. And as always, you can get hold of me by emailing support@DRoseBusiness.com. As ever, the work that DRose does very much linked to the UN SDGs. We believe our work contributes by reducing inequalities. We improve workplaces, so we help with economic growth. We provide, I wouldn't say necessarily quality education, but quality learning and development. We do talk about health and well-being a lot, emotional health and well-being, mental health and well-being, physical health and well-being, because the things are not separate. We believe that by creating good and inclusive work environments, by improving how leaders develop social impact work, we improve industry innovation and infrastructure, especially as we work a lot with the third and public sector spaces. We are committed to a living wage and upper salaries. We are trying to move away from limited resources for communities to challenge poverty. We also, maybe not so much sustainable cities, but very much sustainable communities is one of our key aims. We try to build community in all the work that we do. We believe obviously in gender equality, and that is, for males and females. I don't think that there's, and all the people who sit in between those two binary spaces, gender equality is a much bigger topic than just women's reproductive health, which is often the thing that comes to mind when we use that term. And then the work we do is very much about partnerships and building structures and systems and habits and behaviours which support our values, which you can see mapped out here. So building those partnerships which link to these values and the goals, which help us build strong institutions founded on peace and justice. I would really appreciate some feedback. I know this video has gone longer than expected. We've actually taken up the full 90 minutes and actually over time. Participation, I used to be a youth worker and an educator in the public sector space. It's something that I'm very passionate about and something that I think actually if we get this right, we change the tide for social impact, for inequality, and for lots of other challenges that we face in society currently. So apologies. I hope you found the time valuable. Please provide feedback by clicking on this QR code, and it will take you through a bunch of questions to help us build our services, to help us understand the value of our content and what else we can do to support your journey and your development in this area. Our next social impact webinar is on accessibility. It will be at 2 p.m. on Wednesday, the 29th of July. We'll be talking about practical approaches and insights to delivering accessibility, building stakeholder relationships, how to avoid initiatives which assume, disempower or discriminate, and applying reasonable adjustments. Please feel free to register for it here if you are watching this before that date. If you're watching that after the end of July 2026, you will be able to connect with that by going to the DRoseAcademy.com website and looking for our content on social impact. Thank you as ever. Please feel free to drop me an email if you have questions or would like to share your experiences. We are very much open to all kinds of, feedback and connection and community and partnership. And then you can also explore our resources and our content by visiting DRoseAcademy.com. As ever, thank you for your time. I really appreciate your presence here and your commitment to building the kind of social impact initiatives which empower people through participation. Have a wonderful week, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video.